Women and Witchcraft in Colonial Latin America. The historiography of witch trials in Latin America unveils a nuanced tapestry of cultural, religious, and racial influences that drove the persecution of alleged witches. This underscores the critical importance of comprehending colonial power dynamics, indigenous belief systems, and gender norms in shaping these events. What were the prevailing societal attitudes toward colonial women in Latin America, and how did these attitudes intersect with beliefs surrounding witchcraft? How did women assume roles both as accusers and accused in witchcraft trials, and in what ways did these roles mirror broader power structures? Lastly, how have the historical injustices against women in witchcraft trials reverberated in contemporary issues of gender inequality and discrimination? By addressing these questions, I aim to unravel the multifaceted layers of the Latin American witch trials and glean insights into their enduring implications on the gender dynamics in that region. It wasn't but a generation ago, in 1978, when Esseron Lavrin published one of the path-breaking collections that established the field of women's gender in Latin America. She remarked that the historical literature on Latin women was rather limited, and Twinem points out in her work titled Women and Gender in Colonial Latin America that the 1970s brought us the study of women's past, the 1980s made us aware of gender, and in the last decade of the millennium, vividly highlighted the need for more global and comparative perspectives on both women's and gender history. Ruth Behar, Laura Lewis, Martha Few, and Catherine Curry have similar historical perspectives on gender and power in colonial Latin America, and each of these women uses case studies of Inquisition records to bolster their historical commentaries, arguments, and perspectives. But each historian and anthropologist puts the emphasis on slightly different aspects, using witchcraft to explore themes such as interpersonal relationships, gender roles, Catholicism, indigenous healing, and the caste system. The historiography will conclude with the work of Norel Martinez. Her focus is on the intersectionalities of colonial gender roles, witchcraft, and the correlation with modern-day women in Latin America. It is important to note that the use of witchcraft and superstitions in colonial Latin America were overwhelmingly based in interpersonal relationships between men and women. Many women depended on non-Hispanic rituals and practices to help them in the realm of love, romance, and abuse. The Catholic Church and Spanish culture left little aid to women in these areas, and therefore women often turn to indigenous rituals to help them in these underserved and often unprotected areas of their lives. Ruth Behar concentrates on the specific genre of sexual witchcraft by exploring three themes: reversive subordination of women, efficacy of women's witchcraft, and mediator role of the church in domestic and sexual matters. Martha Few takes the history of witchcraft trials in a more feminist direction, stating that women manipulated religious symbols, language, and rituals to push against the narrowly defined structure of their lives. Few argues that colonial women appropriated political and religious discourses and transformed them in unexpected ways that even the church and colonial elites could not have anticipated. Few concludes the women's actions were not a direct attack on church or state authority. They did, however, use religious resistance to push back outwardly against narrowly defined structures of their lives, creating an identity for themselves as women within colonial patriarchal structures. She uses historical witchcraft cases from Santiago de Guatemala to illustrate how individuals in colonial Latin America appropriated religious and cultural practices to challenge societal norms and beliefs. Few maintains her stance in her more recent work that female witches in the 17th and 18th century Santiago, Guatemala did not attempt to overthrow colonial rule. Neither were they passive victims in colonial political and patriarchal power. Martha Few research illuminates how colonial women in Latin America creatively appropriated religious and cultural traditions to challenge and reshape their societal roles within patriarchal structures. Through analyzing witchcraft cases like those of Donna Lorenza and Sebastiana de la Cruz, Few reveals how women manipulated these symbols and rituals to carve out identities. Her work underscores the agency and ingenuity of women in negotiating their place within the colonial order, showcasing a nuanced form of resistance against prevailing norms and beliefs. Where fewer and Behar look at the history of witch trials through similar lenses of gender, love magic, and resistance to religious and patriarchal power, Laura Lewis, in her book Hall of Mirrors, takes an ethnographic look at judicial records to explore witchcraft from the domain of power that drew on gendered and caste distinctions to complicate the colonial hierarchy. Lewis even states witchcraft was not, then, an autonomous realm of resistance. It was instead a set of discourses and practices derived from the colonial implications of caste. The conflicts embodied spoke to the struggles characteristic of hegemony. Lewis argues that witchcraft trials and the relationship between accused and the accusers were based on the dynamics of caste politics, and that the politics of the caste system comprised of two interconnected and parallel paths of power. Lewis argues that witchcraft trials and the relationship between accused and accusers were based on the dynamics of caste politics, and that the politics of the caste system comprised of two interconnected and parallel paths of power. She uses the case of Adriana to highlight the significance of kinship, friendship, and patronage connections to Spaniards, as well as those linking individuals to Indians. The initial patterns reflect colonialization processes that structured caste to elevate Spaniards and Spanish identity while marginalizing Indians and Indianness. This transformed individuals of African, mulatto, and mestizo descent into mediators who expanded Spanish influence. Through the case study of Adriana Ruiz, a free black woman accused of witchcraft, Lewis illustrates how caste politics shaped the dynamics of witch trials, which individuals drawing on caste symbolisms and connections to Spaniards to navigate colonial values and power dynamics. Catherine Curry's research and analysis of Inquisition records flirts with some of the same themes as Behar, Few, and Lewis. Curry does, like Behar, speak to love magic and acknowledges that most cases brought before the Mexican Inquisition regarded romance. She doesn't take the same stance that love magic is a way for women to exert power in a patriarchal system, nor does she see witchcraft as a method of resistance to societal norms like Few does. She also doesn't take Lewis's stance that the witchcraft trials were strictly a product of limitations placed by the different races within the caste system. Curry's work does include each of the themes of the other historians, but she takes the approach that the trials were a way of eliminating atypical cultures. Inquisition became a tool of cultural homogenization and church-state control. While Curry acknowledges the prevalence of love magic and romance-related cases in the Inquisition, she diverges from attributing these practices to women's empowerment within the patriarchal system or viewing witchcraft as resistance to societal norms. Instead, Curry presents the trials as a mechanism for cultural homogenization and state control, illustrating how the Inquisition targeted individuals like Catalina de Miranda, who deviated from colonial norms and challenged Catholic cultural values. The trial of Catalina de Miranda underscores broader societal issues surrounding gender, cultural dynamics, and the complex interactions between Spanish and indigenous spiritual practices in colonial Spanish society. Through her analysis, Curry underscores the role of the Inquisition in enforcing societal conformity and maintaining church-state control, particularly in prosecuting individuals perceived as living outside the accepted norms of colonial society. How have historical injustices against women in witchcraft trials reverberated into contemporary issues of gender inequality, violence against women, and discrimination? Scholars like Norel Martinez have explored the contemporary resurgence of witchcraft. Martinez argues that women are connecting to the history of witch hunts with the oppression of their communities and are reclaiming La Bruja for political purposes. For example, she says that this phenomenon of growing feminist consciousness of among young women that the dark history of persecution of witches as women who resisted patriarchy represents the intensification of women's rights and on nature as a whole. Martinez makes a connection between contemporary historic resistance movements, such as the pro-life movements throughout the Americas, with the colonial regimes of Latin America that sought to destroy native religious practices and healing knowledge by deeming it devil worship. According to Martinez, the historical persecution of midwives intersects with contemporary challenges faced by midwives in regions like the US-Mexico border, where midwifery practices are being reintegrated as a response to issues of disposability and exploitation of women. She examines the documentary Catching Babies to explore the role of midwives at the birth center in El Paso, serving women from Ciudad Juarez, many of whom face marginalization and limited access to health care. Reintegrating indigenous traditions into modern midwifery practices represents a step towards decolonizing birth, reclaiming cultural practices, and humanizing childbirth. The historical injustices against women in witchcraft trials have reverberated in contemporary issues of gender inequality, violence against women, and discrimination, as highlighted by scholars like Norel Martinez. Martinez argues that women are reclaiming the history of the witch hunts to resist oppression and advocate for women's rights, connecting historical persecution with modern feminist consciousness. Scholars like Behar, Few, Lewis, and Curry provide diverse perspectives on these historical events. Behar's work explores themes of gender, power dynamics, and resistance through witchcraft, while Few emphasizes how women creatively appropriated religious symbols to challenge societal norms. Lewis takes an ethnographic approach, linking witchcraft to caste distinctions and colonial hierarchies. Curry offers insights into how the Inquisition functioned as a tool of cultural homogenization and state control. Moreover, the essay underscores how historical injustices against women in witchcraft trials continue to resonate in contemporary gender inequality and discrimination. Norel Martinez argue that reclaiming the history of witch hunts is essential for advancing women's rights and resisting oppression. Martinez's examination of midwifery history further illustrates how acknowledging traditional knowledge is crucial to addressing modern healthcare challenges and promoting women's empowerment. In summary, the study of women in witchcraft in colonial Latin America provides valuable insights into historical power dynamics and gender relations. By understanding these complex narratives, we can better comprehend the enduring implications of past injustices on contemporary issues of gender inequality and discrimination.